And our next panel will feature speakers from the clinical and research space to give us their thoughts on current highlights, but also needs and gaps in these areas. The panel is called Where We Stand: Diagnosis, Treatment, and Research Gaps. And we're going to begin by welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Svetlana Shinkareva from the University of South Carolina.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I'm an experimental psychologist, and part of my research is focused on how effective information from things we see and things we hear is integrated in the brain. For misophonia research, in Jamie's Ward talk, there was this small dot as misophonia, so I'm there, not in the outer circles, right in the middle. And there was a great question from the audience about visual triggers, and it's a very interesting but challenging question to study. So in our work, we focused on triggers that have both auditory and visual components. And we're interested how the visual component alone, so seeing someone chew without hearing the sound, is represented. And what happens when someone just thinks about a trigger without the sound or a video? And we study those questions through looking at behavior, so subjective judgments. We're looking at bodily responses, so there's physiological recordings, and we're looking at brain responses through neuroimaging. I'm going to share the results of the study that's still going, so it's quite preliminary, but to give you an idea what that type of research is like. So we invite participants with misophonia to participate, and we make sure that they're able to undergo neuroimaging experiments. And then we spend about 5 hours with them over 2 visits. So it's a very time-intensive experiment. And for every participant with misophonia, we're matching them on as closely as possible on demographics with a control participant. And in our studies, we actually do elicit misophonic response in the lab. So for that, we are trying to match the triggers, meeting participants where they are. So we ask people what they're triggered by. Out of that list, we select the ones that have the visual component, because that's exactly what we're studying. And then we're trying to elicit the misophonic response. Now, in this type of research, one of the great bottlenecks was the availability of trigger stimuli. So we have Dr. Hansen's group, Dr. Davidenko's group created and shared some great sets. For the type of things that we're studying, we had to create our own. So we released recently Misophonia Audiovisual Trigger Archive, which has over 1,000 triggering stimuli, and those are very specific. So it's not just chewing, but specific type of chewing. So it's a lot of variability. We hope that other people will find this helpful. In the experiment, the stimuli are matched to misophonia sufferer. We not only select the things that they might be triggered by sounds, but we also make sure that in non-triggering stimuli, they're truly non-triggering. And then for each misophonia participant, we match them closely in control, and the pair exposed to exactly the same stimuli. And our participants either hear, watch silent videos, or think about different sounds that can be triggering, like chewing, generally aversive, like a chair scraping the floor, or non-aversive stimuli, like a fire crackling. And then we examine bodily and brain responses. For bodily responses, we getting responses from facial muscles. We're looking at heart rate, body temperature. And then for each sound, sight, or mental imagery prompt, we're asking misophonia participants of their level of distress, from 1, not at all, to 4, extremely. We don't expect control group participants to be distressed, so we're asking how antisocial the stimulus was. And what we've seen that on average, misophonia participants do have higher level of distress for trigger stimuli compared to aversive stimuli, whether they're heard, seen, or just even thought about in that. And that shows up in bodily responses. Misophonia generally is very highly collaborative and multidisciplinary field. We're certainly benefiting from collaborating with computer scientists, and we are incorporating machine learning methods in our work. So we can ask really cool questions with that. For example, if we look at all physiological recordings at the same time, and we tell on a trial by trial basis if someone is experiencing a trigger, aversive or non-aversive stimulus. And the answer is we can for sounds and visuals, not much for mental imagery. And we can do that much better for misophonia sufferers. And that's entirely probably driven by triggering stimuli. We can also look at what type of physiological signals actually help us to determine the stimulus type on a trial by trial basis. And it's heart rate, temperature, muscle potentiation, and corrugator muscle. In another line of research, we're trying to summarize what does misophonic response look like. It might sound trivial, but it's not. When you observe people undergoing being triggered, there is no facial responses necessarily. People are very good about keeping that private. But with computer vision, you can actually recognize the subtle differences. So you're seeing a little visualization for a subgroup of participants who are having a cringing response that's very subtle, that might not be detected by just looking at the image. The most exciting application, perhaps, and seeing if bodily signals would be informative whether someone has misophonia or not. So we were actually able to separate misophonia sufferers from non-misophonia group based on bodily signals when people were perceiving trigger and non-triggering stimuli together, which was very exciting. And that didn't matter if they heard those stimuli, watched silent videos, or merely thought about triggers and non-triggers. And even more exciting for us, our data seems to indicate that even when people hear, see, or think about non-triggering stimuli, so we're talking about chairs scraping or wind chimes going, so something that's not triggering for individual, that's still informative of whether they have misophonia or not, and that shows up in physiological responses. So it really points out to misophonia being more of a general sensitivity condition, connecting to points that Dr. Bard made earlier. Now, we also investigate the responses in the brain. And when we consider the misophonia group and look at responses, brain areas that come up for processing triggers compared to aversive stimuli, a very specific network of areas come out. So Salen's network is very representative there. And we're seeing very similar network, whether it's listening to trigger and aversive sounds or seeing silent videos of that. For mental imagery, we're also getting similar regions, but it's a much weaker activation. We came in with a very strong hypothesis. So there were really groundbreaking studies showing, I'm referring to Kumar and all paper, showing the misophonic response on brain activation. And we hypothesized that we should see exactly the same thing at the absence of sound. When someone is seeing someone chew, without hearing the sound, probably the brain response is going to be very similar compared to aversive sounds. And we expected the same for mental imagery. So internally generated trigger without hearing or seeing anything, just thinking about triggers compared to aversive sounds. And indeed, we're seeing that insular cortex is differentially activated for processing triggers and aversive sounds for people with and without misophonia. So we're seeing similar results on average for anterior cingulate cortex, but that's mostly driven by visual stimuli. So we're describing the responses to trigger stimuli across the modalities. So auditory, visual, and mental imagery. So the conclusions that we can draw from that is very consistent with the picture that we get over multiple studies from other labs. So people do differ in what triggers them and severity of the responses. That's been shown. Dr. Hansen's work showed a variety of triggers and documented that for the first time. We're showing the same variability in bodily responses and brain responses as well. And those responses are not only in to sounds, but also the visuals that accompanying those sounds, as well as mental imagery. And we're also seeing indication of general sensory sensitivity. So that misophonia may reflect to everyday stimuli that extend beyond the triggering ones. So looking ahead, we think it's important to look at what aspects are shared with general sensory sensitivity and what's specific to misophonia by itself. So with that, I'd like to thank the Misophonia Research Fund for the general support of this work. A big shout out to participants. So it's a huge investment of someone's time, and we're actually triggering misophonic response in the lab, so not everyone is up for that. So this work would not be possible with the involvement of people who are interested in moving the field forward. And also, as we worked on that, and I have to admit, not at the very beginning of our starting to work on this project, we've realized the importance of giving back to community. So we're doing a lot of misophonia awareness work in our community. We have a team of wonderful researchers who are very passionate about that subject. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. Next up, we will have Dr. Deepika Anand from the CBT Center of Chicago, Behavioral Treatment for Misophonia.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to start by saying I really appreciated the previous panel and hearing from people with the experience of misophonia, because it's such a reminder of why we're here and why we're doing this. And you're so brave, and it was wonderful to hear all of your perspectives. So just a brief introduction. I am a clinical psychologist, and I work currently as a clinician. I started working in treatment and research of misophonia when I worked at Duke with the Center for Misophonia and Emotion Regulation with Dr. Rosenthal, but now I'm in private practice, and I treat misophonia using cognitive behavioral therapy. I work only with adults, but I believe that a lot of the principles for treating misophonia may generalize to children as well. My goal for this presentation is to outline a behavioral approach for treating misophonia using the research that we have. Also, I am part of a consultation team of pretty amazing 6 clinicians from around the country. We meet virtually once a month. We discuss cases that we're working on and share information. So I reached out to them in preparing for this because I wanted to give you a representative idea of what treatment for misophonia could look like. So I'm going to weave their insights in as well. So hopefully this leaves you with an idea of what to expect if you were to reach out for treatment for misophonia. Okay. All right. So let's just start with why even consider behavioral therapy for what seems like an auditory condition. So right from when the term misophonia was coined, it was differentiated from hyperacusis and other auditory conditions, in that the misophonic response doesn't seem to depend so much on the physical properties of the sound, like the loudness, the pitch, etc., but on the context of the sound, like who makes the sound, how are you feeling when you hear the sound, what's your previous experience with the sound. For example, research shows that people with misophonia are much more likely to be distressed if the sound is made by someone else than if they themselves are making it, right? So the person matters. Based on neurological research, Berger et al. Proposed the social cognitive perspective of misophonia, where they said it's important to not just look at how a person perceives the sound, but how they perceive the actions producing the sound. And then based on statistical analyses of self-report responses, we find that how a person feels and thinks when they hear a sound, as well as their beliefs about misophonia, are very highly related to the impairment from misophonia. So what that suggests is if we can treat that, how a person thinks, how a person feels, what their beliefs are, that can affect the impact that misophonia has on them. In a way, that's good news, because even though misophonia research is new, our understanding of how to do that, which is change a person's thoughts, emotions, behaviors, beliefs, isn't. In fact, we have decades of research that has developed evidence-based strategies to do just that, and a large number of them fall under the category or the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy. So here I just list some of those strategies. I'm not going to go into detail into each of them, but just to highlight a few, cognitive restructuring is a technique of changing maladaptive thinking patterns, making thinking more flexible. Attentional control strategies train clients to flexibly shift their focus from one thing to another, etc. And when you start to look at current treatment research in misophonia, you start to see preliminary evidence that these strategies that we have studied and used for years and know how to use may actually work in reducing misophonia severity. So this is a table. I know there's it's not very clear. There's a lot going on here, but this is from Rosenthal et al., the review paper that reviewed treatment studies for misophonia. What I want to highlight here is they list some of the strategies used across these different studies. So just to kind of name some: cognitive restructuring, relaxation exercises, etc., acceptance and distress tolerance. And these may show some evidence of working. These are the case studies. These are the open trials and clinical trials. I encourage you to look up the paper as well. And here's a table that I created with some of the treatment studies that were published after the review paper came out. And again, I just want to highlight here strategies that we're familiar with showing some evidence of working with misophonia. I'm going to slow that down, don't worry. To summarize, I feel like there's some key ingredients to the treatments that seem to work. Here are some of them. It seems to help when you are able to change how a person thinks about the actions producing the sound, right? It also seems to help to create flexibility in a client's beliefs about themselves as well as others, particularly making them less judgmental. It helps to teach clients how to better tolerate difficult thoughts, emotions, and sensations that occur, especially those immediate responses when they hear a sound, because squashing it, as was mentioned previously, suppressing it, resisting it, judging yourself for it actually seems to make distress much worse and impairment worse as well. And then finally, empowering clients to act in ways that are more consistent with their goals, even when they experience a trigger. If not, that immediate response once the response passes, right? Giving them a sense of empowerment. And then I kind of reached out to the consultation team and asked, when you're in the room with clients, what do you find yourself doing and that you think works? And I've included mine as well here. So they kind of broke down into two categories. So there's the strategies that seem to work at the time that a client experiences the trigger. So again, this is a lot of what I said earlier, teaching them to tolerate the distress better, self-soothing, things like that, relaxation, teaching them to redirect attention, etc. But it's also important to consider factors that may be more distal to the sound itself, but can still increase vulnerability or influence the misophonic response. So these include longer-term beliefs about what it even means to have misophonia, providing psychoeducation to the client, but also to people they live with, to family members, loved ones, about this physical response that's happening when they hear a sound so that they understand that rather than judge it. And then you see that we find ourselves using strategies like improving emotional boundaries in relationships, teaching clients to appropriately understand the needs they have, and then express them to others. So now we're getting at kind of foundation of these relationships, especially with the ones that are really meaningful to them, to make them feel more safe and predictable. And then, of course, improving self-care, which was touched on by one of the speakers earlier, as well as working on emotion regulation generally, addressing comorbidities that can all sort of influence the experience of misophonia. So we kind of have an idea of what strategies may work, right? So the next question is, when a client walks in, how do you choose which of these strategies to actually use? And this, like, how do we package them into a treatment plan, right? And so a process-based approach may be useful here. So this is not a branded type of therapy, rather it's an approach where when a client comes in, you understand the client and you create a unique understanding of that specific client called a case conceptualization. And then the evidence-based strategies are chosen for that person. So it's tailored to the client. So treatment could look different from one client to the other. It's also a flexible approach because as we learn more about misophonia and strategies that could work, it can easily accommodate and fold those in to this approach. And then finally, it's also flexible throughout the course of treatment because it's iterative. So we try something, if it doesn't work, we can change it. And so it's responsive to where the client is in any given moment. So I'm going to give this a slightly more concrete form. One tool that's helpful in implementing an approach like this is the self-monitoring form called the Basic Patterns Grid, which you can download for free from the Duke Seymour website. Essentially what it is it's a form that the client takes home and then starts to fill out. So when they experience a trigger sound, they're trying to write down how they respond before, during, and after the trigger. Okay, and they're doing this in different categories. How did they behave? What were they doing with their attention? What were they attending to? What was going on in their body? How did they communicate? And what were they thinking? So they start to fill this out over a week or two. And then when they come in, we look at these responses together. And then we start to see what patterns emerge. And then together, collaboratively, we discuss what are the patterns that seem to be working and what's actually getting in the way, right? Making this worse. And for those, then I choose evidence-based strategies corresponding to that pattern. So an example, this is from a client I worked with who's a 20-year-old female client who lives at home with her parents. This particular trigger was crunching chips sound by a coworker. So early in treatment, we found that one of the things that she was doing was right when she entered her workplace, she was already scanning. She was trying to pay attention to where he's sitting. What does he have for lunch? Thinking about it, right? And for her, that wasn't working. It was actually prolonging distress. So one of the things that we did was for several sessions, we worked on mindfulness training to improve attentional control. And then she was able to use grounding strategies. So when she noticed her attention wander to a potential sound, she was able to bring it back to sensations she was having in the moment. She was also making some catastrophic and hopeless interpretations in the moment of the trigger. And so we found that creating alternative thoughts based on the evidence she collected, which were that she was actually safe and these sounds were typically temporary, was helpful. So then she would rehearse saying these thoughts to herself in the moment. We worked on relaxation strategies to reduce physical tension throughout, before, during, as well as after. And so that, along with attention training, helped her kind of better tune into her body and kind of sense where she was and what she was experiencing, and then deploy a skill accordingly. Now, I want to say something about this client, which is we worked on a lot of these triggers and patterns that were more obvious in the beginning sessions. And then as we kept working together, there were some patterns that emerged that were not very evident in the beginning. So this client lived at home with her parents. One of her main triggers was her mother sighing, yawning, and sneezing. And as we worked together, we realized that in that relationship with her mother, the client didn't feel a lot of control or autonomy. For many reasons. One in particular was her mother would demand that the client do certain chores around the house, like cook dinner for everyone. And she would make these demands at times when the client was working on homework, really stressed about a test she had to take the next day. And then even when she tried to convince her and express justified needs, like, can I please do this another time, that was met with resistance. Another part of this is that when she would make these demands, her mother would complain about her own health. She would say, I'm in pain, she had arthritis, I'm really tired, you have to do this for me. And the client's perception was, my mom doesn't take care of her own health because she wasn't, in her perception, she wasn't eating right, etc. So when she heard the sound of sighing, yawning, one of the judgments that passed her mind was she doesn't even take care of her health. And that's a threat to her autonomy. She also was in a state of hypervigilance at home for many reasons, that being one of them. And so I say this not to say this is every misophonia client, but to say that sometimes it's important to go deeper and to see if there are actual stressors in the environment that are keeping that threat system activated. And that needs to be attended to as well to help with the misophonia. And sometimes it might be current stressors, sometimes they may be past stressors that have led to conditioned responses, but important to go beyond the surface. Okay, last seconds. I wanted to put up here some common misconceptions that come up with clients, and just to highlight a couple here. Clients sometimes believe that they have to avoid all triggers completely to manage their symptoms. And then conversely, clients sometimes believe they have to confront all their triggers all the time to cure themselves. And I don't think either extreme is helpful. I think sometimes avoidance may be needed in order to function, to give them a sense of control, especially if it doesn't get in the way of value-directed behavior. Finally, I asked the clinicians, and I can echo this as well, what gives you hope? And they all said, even though we don't have a gold standard treatment for misophonia yet, they've seen meaningful change. And, that can look like reduced misophonia severity, stronger sense of agency, greater confidence in their ability to manage triggers. So that gives us hope. Yeah, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Deepika. Our next speaker will be Dr. Michael Toig, Utah State University, Acceptance, Mindfulness, and Behaviorism to help those with misophonia.
Well, thank you all for having me. Thank you those who are on Zoom. It's a treat to be here. There's my clock. It's a treat to be here. I have been sitting out here watching all the work everyone's doing, and I'm a very lucky person that my career gets to be to help people. It makes every day fun, makes every day interesting. So thank you for letting me be part of this. I tried to prepare what is sort of a sciencey talk aimed to people with misophonia. So I'm going to show those of you who like data, you'll get to see my data. Those of you who are not as impressed by graphs, I'm mixing in all the clinical guidance I can offer. Oh, which slide's up? Okay, that one. Title. So how did I get into this work? Why am I interested in this work? So I'm kind of a unique professor. I have two labs. If we go which side, the one on this side, one on the left, I'm part of an audiology lab where we really focus on person-centered care and helping audiologists most effectively work with their clients and all the psychological issues that come with having an audiological condition. So I was pulled into that group to sort of fill a space that audiologists struggled to fill. Concurrently, I am a psychologist and I run a pretty traditional psychotherapy research lab, and we test interventions. Some of my favorite ones are misophonia, but also OCD and trichotillomania, people who pull their hair out. I love working in anxiety disorders. So when the opportunity showed up to do more work in misophonia, I was fairly well situated. I have a pretty good understanding of audiology issues and a pretty solid understanding of psychological issues. So they tie together pretty nicely, and it's really awesome having this team who can sort of work between these spaces. So here's my my first point of this talk for those of you who have misophonia. You're not a car, you're not a robot, you're not a computer. You're a complex, interesting person who has a lot of depth, a lot of history. You live in a context. So Dr. Ward's first graph that had the big bubble, I'm interested in that big bubble. Like, you're a human being who lives in all these places, and how that influences you and how you interact with that is a big part of the misophonia. So maybe this graph is sort of hard to read. Sorry if it's small. What it's showing, it's just some data from one of our trials, is that context matters a lot in how the sounds affect the individual. So I'm going to show another one. We interviewed everyone who participated in our study. This is 60 different individuals. And when we went back and we scored those interviews, and the ways people described how they felt in the moment where a stimulus is triggering, or how they felt after the moment. I mean, you should be creative writing, authors. The in-depth stories of like what you're feeling and the emotions that you're having and what you're thinking about people. Like there's good anger in there. There's like high frustration, interest in harming people in like a, not a real way, but that's the feeling that people are having. There's a space in psychology from when you have that feeling in the context that you're having it, there's a space where you can decide how to interact with that feeling. Like when I say you're not a robot, you don't have a feeling and behave. You have a feeling, you can notice that feeling, you can look at that feeling, you can look at those thoughts, and you can get better, or you can find different ways to interact with it. I mean, when you think, if I work in OCD, people are having these pretty disturbing thoughts. We have the ability to teach them to notice that thought, look at it, choose how you're going to interact with it. And the analogy I like to use is it can turn like a 10-pound weight into maybe a 5-pound weight. It doesn't get rid of it, it just doesn't show up with quite as much force. So part of our interest is, can we do that with people with misophonia? I'm going to show you one more illustration, just showing this kind of how this shows up interestingly for each person in their own way and how therapy sort of has to tailor to that. So we took all these individuals in our study and we kind of analyzed what are the internal experiences that they're having. And the basic part is that it shows up in different styles for different people, and then we can tailor this intervention to the different individuals. So one of the ways that we can help someone catch their internal experience and give them an option of how they want to respond to it. I like to think of it like metacognitive, like you have a cognition or you have an emotion, but you can look at that, right? And when you can look at it and have that little second, you can choose how to respond to it. Well, psychological flexibility, probably the easiest way to think about it is if you think of like the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama would be like pinnacle psychologically flexible. He would be someone who's very good at seeing what he feels, seeing what he's thinking, and choosing whether he wants to be pushed around by it. My dad, on the other hand, like a 80-year-old, farmer, attorney guy up in Wisconsin, not psychologically flexible, right? When he feels, he acts, right? There isn't a time between the two where he kind of looks at it and says, what does he want to do? Well, we built a measure of psychological flexibility in misophonia. Can you notice your internal reaction and your thoughts and look at it and decide what to do? Now I have two graphs here, sides. The one on the left is psychological flexibility in misophonia. And it's this is the money we got from So Quiet. Thank you for supporting my student to collect these data. What we find here is that if you look at controls, so people who don't have misophonia versus people who do, the people who do on a measure of misophonia psychological flexibility is they struggle a lot more. They are much more inflexible. And then if you go to the next graph on the right, this is general psychological inflexibility. Like I could give this measure to everyone in this room. This isn't misophonia specific, and they're also more inflexible. So there's an indicator that there probably is something in misophonia where people, when they have these internal experiences, they quickly jump on them, they quickly fight with them, they push them away real hard. And as you said, when you push, it comes back stronger. We have known that for 40 years in psych. There's a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, has 1,000 randomized trials. It's a thing that I've been researching my whole career. It's a full therapy, and the other people who work in misophonia use pieces of this. I know some of us went to the same schools even. What we teach in ACT is to notice your internal experiences, recognize them for what they are, which are thoughts and feelings, make space for them, and then carry that with you as you be the kind of person you want to be in the world. So we have done, not we, I mean, I think you did one and Julie did one. There are case studies saying ACT is a useful intervention for misophonia. And then with funding from the Misophonia Research Fund, we ran a randomized trial. It's finished. It's in the revise and resubmit stage at a journal. So hopefully it'll be in the published stage, lickety split. And we took 60 adults, put them in one condition versus another condition. So these are two active conditions and time is tight. So I'll get to the kind of punchline. If you look at the responder, so this is 10 individual psychotherapy sessions with, all the bells and whistles of a randomized trial. So an assessor who's unaware of treatment condition, audiological assessments, at the beginning, the therapists who are, working in both conditions and supervise. It's all the fancy stuff. That if you just look at the responder rate, these are two active conditions, and we're kind of talking about the ACT one a little bit more. We're looking at about a 50% response rate. And response rate's actually kind of a hard term. It's saying like you're in a condition where we would say you don't struggle with this. I mean, it may be present, but you're no longer at that clinical end. So positive thing, there are things we can do from a psychological end to move people from that really struggling phase to a not really struggling phase. There are some between condition differences when you look at client report. When you're looking at assessor rated, it's not different between conditions, but that's okay because they're both active conditions. There are some between condition differences when you're looking at self-report. Now, back to that, remember I said we had to measure psychological flexibility, which is how you interact with your thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Now that decreases significantly across both conditions, which to me would say that this is, or it could be, it's correlated, it's related in the right way. This is part of people getting better, is that you learn how to do that. Now, my slides are out of order, so I'm going to do that real fast. Then when we look at people on that measure of how psychologically flexible are you, because we gave it to them at the beginning of treatment, the people who are less psychologically flexible, the people who fight against their thoughts and feelings more, actually do better in the treatment. So at the beginning of treatment, if you're someone who's pretty resistant to your thoughts and feelings, you'll respond more. And to me, that makes sense. We see that with other disorders. It's basically saying, if this is an issue for you, then you're more likely to get better from that. If this isn't an issue for you, then we didn't need to teach it to you. And this is something we'll learn as we do more work in this areas of what conditions tell us to do which treatments. Now, I showed you some earlier data. It looks a little better up there than it does on my screen, where we're able to categorize people into different groupings at the beginning. And these numbers aren't actually statistically different, but if you look at the reactive condition, which is on your right, the two they're again, not statistically different, but you have to say there's like some trend there. The treatment works differently for these individuals, the two treatments. So you have the progressive relaxation training and then the acceptance and commitment therapy, which again, I think is just a cool, which I think is a cool thing to think about as we keep developing these treatments, that it's not going to be a package. We do want to study packages. There is utility to that because like if you're a hospital, you want to know what package to use, or if you're a healthcare provider, but at the individual level, yes, of course, we're going to do individual things. And this is interesting, meaning that there is something to the matching of the intervention to the person. Okay, so my last slide with my minute 46. If you're someone out there who is struggling, here would be my little take home, that practice learning how to see what you're feeling, like before you walk into a situation or when you're in a situation or after the situation. Notice your body is doing something. Notice you're having particular cognitions. You have the ability with practice to catch that that's happening. It doesn't have to be automatic. With some exercises and some, meditate a little bit, do some yoga. Like, you can learn how to see what's happening within you, and then you can see it for what it is. It is a thought, it is a feeling, it is a physiological reaction, and you can practice observing it with sort of some openness. It's not easy. You will never be perfect at it, but you can get a little better at it. If you can learn how to do it, the whole thing shows up with less power, right? Your 10-pound weight will be a 5-pound weight. And then the last part is you can learn how to carry that 5-pound weight around in life and start engaging with the things you've wanted to engage with. And then once you start doing that, the reinforcers kick in. Like when you start engaging with things that you liked, there starts becoming more meaning to carrying this weight with you. And that kind of keeps the ball going. All right, it's my last slide. Thank you so much for having me here. I absolutely appreciate everything you're all doing. Thanks.
All right, so I want to call all of our speakers up, as well as our moderator, Dr. Heather Hansen.
Hello, everyone. So again, I'm Dr. Heather Hansen. I am a researcher and also have a misophonia myself. So I'm really excited to get to talk to experts here on both research and clinical practice. We're going to kind of do more audience questions so far. So brainstorm while you're sitting here, questions you might want to ask our panel, but I'll just like get one started as you guys are brainstorming. One of the things that I noticed is a common theme, both in the earlier talks, listening to our lived experience panel, and also throughout these three presentations, was the individual differences that exist in misophonia, whether that's the type of stimuli you need to use, whether you have a large sound bank because everyone has personalized triggers, or whether that's the treatment plans you use, the context that matters, all of those different things. So I am just curious from your experiences in research and clinical practice, are there patterns you're noticing? Do you have advice for people how we do clinical and research work moving forward to accommodate these individual differences? Or anything surprise you that comes up, things like that.
I was like, do you want to go first? And then she's like, no, go for it. I tried to be nice. So one of the things that stands out to me is I came up at other places so far that the context in terms of how the person is doing, where is the presenter from this morning, like in terms of sleep, in terms of health, in terms of additional life stressors. As a psychologist, comorbid diagnoses, I noticed that presence of anxiety and depression. Those variables can sure affect how misophonia is showing up in the moment. And I also think as a professional, if I'm working with someone, that I have to factor that in. I'll just give a quick example and try to make sure this is all confidential enough. I had someone who said, my sleep is bad, a client, and I said, "Oh, it's a bummer you don't wear an Apple Watch or something." And she's like, "Oh, I do." And then I was like, "Well, what does it say?" And she looks, 4 hours a night. Like, of course, everything is amplified for the next days. So, acceptance and commitment therapy didn't have a sleep hygiene module, but that was probably as important as anything else. So I just say there's all these other factors that we should address, and they're going to make a big difference even before we jump into our intervention.
Yeah, I think as far as themes are concerned, and this came up actually with a lot of what people were saying was the squashing, right? That experiential avoidance is what you would call it. Now, the squashing could happen for different reasons. I think the squashing can happen because you're shamed or guilty. I shouldn't feel this way. It makes me a bad person. What will they think? Or the squashing in the case of the client I mentioned was happening in many different ways because my needs are not important. For whatever reason, however you learned that lesson, my needs are dangerous. They're a threat to me or to our relationships or something. So those are kind of patterns that I see, and I'm kind of looking for. Again, you can come to that point from different paths, right? So I think it is a combination of looking for the patterns because you do want to know, okay, what strategy can I use? And you want to know what to study. And in terms of what do you research, I think dismantling studies, researching specific strategies that go at specific targets is really helpful, like strategies that increase cognitive flexibility. And then you track cognitive flexibility over time. Is that changing? And is that corresponding to misophonia change? Interpersonal functioning, right? Assertiveness training. How much of an impact does that have? Psychoeducation of family, that versus not having that. How much? So I think just really looking at components, you need something to work with. And so that's why those patterns are helpful to pay attention to.
Anything on your end? Also.
Thank you. I think it's very important, excuse me, it's very important to embrace individual differences. It's certainly a huge challenge in research, but if we don't do that, we really run a risk of describing something that's just like one subset of misophonia, not showing the brief experience. So when we started, we were aware that people have different triggers and that, but we were really shocked of how different bodily sensations are in response to that. So we're fully embracing that, and there's so many questions to ask. So definitely a good thing to focus on.
Great. Audience?
Hi, excellent talks. I have two questions. One is related to individual differences related to gender or sex in terms of the presentation, in terms of treatment approaches. Because it seems, given the place of women in society in a lot of different family contexts, the family may not be as amenable to changing as they would be if it was, right? And depends on different cultural context that they are not very open to changing their behavior because it works for them, right? If the 20-year-old daughter is cooking dinner all the time, it works for a lot of people. So how do you change that in that context? And then the second question I had, but I can wait on that.
I can start answering that. So unfortunately, and it seems to be a theme across studies, that our samples are not that diverse as we'd like. So they're predominantly female, and that's probably a reflection of who signs up for research studies. So that's a fantastic question to address that we're not able to at that time.
I haven't seen enough, I think, just from my clinical work to answer that question definitively. But I think the theory is really interesting because, again, as I said, I think if the end point is my need can't be expressed and doesn't matter, and there's different ways you can get there, right? And I wouldn't be surprised if cultural factors can feed into that message. So that's the benefit of, when you're doing clinical work and you see the whole person, you get to be sensitive to every piece of it. How did that learning happen? And so, yeah, it's a good reminder to pay attention to that.
I had a second question about the number of trigger sounds. So I've come across another study where someone reported having 50 trigger sounds. So would you speak to that, or would it be a general sound sensitivity disorder in that case, right? Because I study hyperacusis as well. And to me, that points to that rather than misophonia, but I'm interested in hearing your opinion.
You're a sound person.
So I'm not a sound person. So we actually, and I would say unfortunately exclude people based on hyperacusis diagnosis. So we do have misophonia participants, and the number of triggers certainly varies by person. Some have very few, some have a lot. By the nature of our research, we invite participants that we can reproduce the trigger in the lab setting. So that means that excludes the person-specific ones. So it's not the sibling that's triggering by chewing, but it's anyone who can trigger that. So I should have clarified that. So.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think differential diagnosis is important, so you're not doing something that can make it worse, or give the wrong message. But I would also say, like, I can see a response getting generalized, because especially if you are making your world smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, then more and more things feel threatening. And so over time, I think I can see a person coming and saying everything, everything. I'm just always in this state, right? So that's the hypothesis that would form in my mind if I were to first hear that.
Should we move? I know there was maybe another hand over here. Questions? Yeah, take it. Or when the microphone gets to you, take it. I'm coming.
So I've lived experience with misophonia, and I'm a researcher in clinical psychology and other topics, but I'm new to misophonia world. And I'm so curious how to balance like all this discussion about individual differences, personalizing treatment with wanting to make more treatment scalable and accessible. Like we don't have a manualized treatment right now, obviously, but like what are your thoughts as clinicians on like some more generalizable factors that like predict early response? What might be like a more transdiagnostic target for like a brief intervention that could be put online to do sort of digital mental health approaches to misophonia treatment?
Yeah, now we have a question in my space that's just more comfortable. So you said you're getting a clinical degree, right? So then I would assume you're in the cognitive behavior therapy writ large zone, which includes things like, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness-based therapies. And those, like, I'll just speak for ACT, but they would be the same for traditional cognitive behavior therapy. If you know how to do it, you know how to do it in many ways with many people, and you're very good at adapting and adjusting. And I think where a lot of us are going is, we may generally park in cognitive behavior therapy or generally park in acceptance and commitment therapy, but we know how to pull in distress tolerance if that's happening. And I think we're all doing that all the time. So what I would suggest as a professor who trains therapists is get really good at like the base intervention you want to use. And then part of the real skill set is how to adjust. And, so it's interesting, like we ran a trial of ACT plus basic, sort of behavior modification things for misophonia. But yeah, across the 30 individuals who were in that condition, we didn't do the exact same thing because it's showing up in these different ways. Some people are struggling at work, some people are struggling at home. Some people it's before, some people are ruminating about it after. So we're using that kind of adjustment. And I think that just time and practice, you get better at how to bend the therapy that you're really good at.
Yeah, maybe we, for the sake of expanding questions, look at, yeah, another one.
Good, is it morning or after? Good morning, everyone. Yeah, My husband and I drove our daughter here from Indiana. And I'm trying not to be emotional. From all perspectives of what we've listened and watched, our daughter suffered this since she was 9 years old, but we didn't know anything about it. And through her own research, she came up with this term. We didn't know what it was. We didn't even know how to help her. And she's this calm, nice kid, always willing to help. So when she came up with this term, she told her dad, and he didn't understand it. I didn't. And she told her dad that he doesn't believe her. Like coming here today, she found out about this seminar, I think on Tuesday. And she said we can go in person or we can do virtual. I told her since we don't know anything about it, it's better off we drive 3 hours to go in person. That will make a difference. Listening to people talk in person, that might make you identify more of you in what they're saying, and that will help us as parents understand what you've been telling us. Our first child, she called me one day at work and she said, Mommy, you never believed her. She's been going through this for so many years, but you didn't believe her. I'm like, I didn't know what it was. How can sound disturb somebody? Like the slightest sound, breathing, she can get it. Chewing, she can get it. Swallowing from a distance, she can get it. I'm like, what type of ears does my daughter have? I was lost. I'm in healthcare, but I was lost. So my point, finally, we moved to Indiana from Maryland. So her primary care referred her to a therapist, and she told me that my daughter is depressed. I'm like, depressed from what? I don't think my daughter is depressed. So she referred her to a therapist. I'm like, what is she going to tell the therapist? What kind of therapy is she going to see? So that is where I rose my brows, and she went to therapy session just once. I'm like, what is she going to say? So finally, she's not going anymore. So my point is, we are so new in this. We don't even know how to go about it. I have listened very well from each and every speaker, and I've understood what has been happening to her. And I feel bad that I've had a child since she was 9. Now she's 17, senior, and she has gone through this by herself. We've been trying to cope at home with her in our own little ways. So how do we start? How do we go about this to help her more? She's going to college next year in the fall. How do we go about this? Please.
Can I hand that one to you? Would you give a brief response to this? And that way we'll kick it to.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I just want to say to know that your child is experiencing something and not understand it has to be such a hard experience to have. And so you're here. I think that's incredible that you found this and you're here. And so you're already doing something. And as far as next steps, I mean, it is unfortunate that we don't have enough therapists that even know what misophonia is, let alone feel comfortable working with it. I'm not going to say have a competence in treating it because I don't know if anyone has competence yet. But just to give you some hope, as I mentioned in the talk, a lot of what we've been using to help people understand what they're feeling, to help people validate themselves, to kind of peel away the layers that are making the experience worse for them. We know how to do that, even if we don't know misophonia treatment. There are a lot of therapists out there who can do that. They may just not know that that might work with misophonia. So definitely try to find a therapist that knows what misophonia is. Be open to explaining your experience to them, right? Because they may not fully understand, but that's okay. They might still be able to help if they know those strategies and if they know CBT. And so, yeah, so I think at this point to say I'm going to find a misophonia treatment provider might be a little hard, right? Because if you have restrictions in terms of where you live and insurance and things like that. But I always love talking with other therapists who end up having a client with misophonia, and then I consult with them and I tell them what I think would be helpful to guide them, and then they're able to help do some of these basic things. Because at the heart of it is emotion, and we know how to work with emotion, right? So I don't know if that answered your
Great.
question.
Yeah, no, this is excellent. And let's continue this conversation over lunch because I'm sure we could all chat forever about this. I recognize timing though. Do we maybe have time for one online?
Yes,
Jennifer?
let's go, let's do, I'd love to go over to Jennifer for online question.
Okay, let me try to put together some of the questions to form one question.
Yeah, great.
Many of the panelists, both people with misophonia, people who are researchers with misophonia, have been referring to the nature of triggers as my mother or my sister is my trigger. Then a lot of our discussion here on chat is everybody saying they have very many different triggers, some that are related to family, some that are absolutely not related to family. Some people are saying they're just, quote, agnostic, and it could be any sound, anywhere, not related to a person. So could you guys quickly speak to that in terms of research, advancing research?
I can start. It's in practice, it's very difficult to study triggers that are specific to an individual because you end up bringing two people into the lab, and that's somewhat of a bottleneck, but definitely a direction to pursue.
Any other thoughts? No is an acceptable answer. That is okay.
Generalize.
Yeah.
Generalize to people.
Yeah.
Rather than family.
Is there anything else big we should hit online?
Is there another question, Jennifer?
I think we're good.
Okay, cool. Wrap up? Yeah, cool. This has been lovely. Thank you for your expertises. And I'm sure we'd all love to pick your brains more over lunch and whatnot, because this is a hot topic. So with that, we'll transition to the next event.
Thank you so much.